Welcome to the Biology 182 lecture series on vertebrates. This video is about tetrapods, amphibians, and caecilians. Students should be able to describe the evolutionary characteristics of amphibians and to understand the different types of amphibians. Amphibians are organisms that successfully invaded land, but usually return to the water to reproduce. Amphibian means both lives. They live in the water and on land. Some amphibians, like the axolotl, have external gills, even as adults. Amphibians can breathe through three different mechanisms. First is cutaneous respiration, where the skin absorbs oxygen. And this can happen through the mouth cavity as well as through the skin. They also have respiration through their lungs, and their lungs breathe in oxygen, but their lungs are poorly developed. And so, although this does work as a mechanism for breathing, even easier for them is buccal pumping. Buccal pumping takes air in and then forces the air into the lungs from the buccal cavity. And oftentimes this buccal breathing creates the frog croak that you hear, although only the males croak. It does come from a small cavity near the vocal cords that vibrate the vocal cords as it pushes the air out. Amphibians are cold-blooded or ectothermic. They have moist skin in order to keep the gas exchange flowing between the skin. They have a three-chambered heart, which decreases the efficiency of the way the blood is transported through the body. So having that moist skin and oxygen exchange through the skin is very helpful for amphibians. They also undergo metamorphosis, and this is regulated by their thyroid. And oddly, they have slime glands, which keeps them nice and moist in the skin. Amphibians reproduce and often undergo metamorphosis, where they have a larval stage that's largely aquatic, and they have predominantly external fertilization. When we look at the various images on the left, you can see all types of ways that amphibians lay their eggs. They can have eggs, as frogs do, that are in gelatinous little clumps, or like toads do, that are in like strips of eggs. They can make like a meringue, or they can have eggs inside a pouch on their back, or they can just have them on their back in an external pouch instead of an internal pouch. Frogs undergo a metamorphosis that goes from eggs to embryos once they're fertilized. Then they become tadpoles, and then they have 2 little legs, and then they get 4 little legs, and then they become an adult frog. Salamanders have eggs and then go through a larval stage that they have gills, actually gills around their head. And then they go into a larval stage with forelimbs, and then they get hind limbs as well and become a salamander. So there are various types of amphibians that we'll talk about, and most often they are tetrapods. There is a type of amphibian called the caecilian that is legless. It does exchange oxygen through its skin and obtains all the other characteristics of an amphibian. Other types of amphibians include frogs and toads, and salamanders and newts. Caecilians are also called gymnophonia. They have a hard pointed skull, and that allows them to burrow underground. They have live young, and some lay eggs that they can lay in their burrows. The young eat the mom's skin. It's dead and fatty, and they can either eat the mom's skin on the outside, or they eat the oviduct from the inside, which is also very fatty. They have tiny tentacles on their head that help them smell, and their eyes are under their skin, so they don't need eyelids. They're very, very tiny. The skin of this egg is translucent, although some do have live young. They are carnivorous, and they are often very small, but they can be found less than 3 inches to over 5 feet long. When we look at the life cycle of the caecilian, they have a Viviparis reproductive cycle, in many species, which involves internal fertilization. Viviparis means that the development of the fetus is internal and they have a live birth. They do have a cloaca, and males have a phallodium. In some Viviparis caecilians, the fetus emerges from its egg membrane as soon as the yolk sac is exhausted. So once it no longer has any food or the materials that it needs to continue developing. And then it uses its tiny baby teeth in order to scrape the tissue from the oviduct. And it's called intrauterine feeding. We also see that the babies in some cases are born as larvae with gills, and they lose their gills shortly after birth. We also can see in these images, the juveniles are eating and feeding on the mother off the skin instead of inside the mother's uterus. Some caecilians give birth to live young, and the eggs stay inside until they fully hatch, but they still do have eggs, they're just internal. The other way that the caecilians can reproduce is through oviparous reproduction and metamorphosis. These caecilians lay eggs, and they have to be either in holes or near water, and some of them coil around the eggs and just keep the eggs with them all the time. They lay the eggs on land, and then the aquatic larvae have to feed on plankton or the mother's skin. And they hatch and they have gills and can swim in the water and eat. And then they lose their gills shortly after birth as they begin to metamorphize, if you will. The next order we'll talk about are Anuera, and these are frogs and toads. Toads are the Bufonidae family. They have short legs and they like to crawl, unlike frogs. They have dry, waterproof skin, and they can be away from water a lot longer than frogs can. They have these warty looking lumps and bumps all over their skin, and they have this flat, dumpy looking body and a really broad nose. Their tadpoles are black, and their eggs look like long string strands of little black polka dots. About 90% of amphibians come from the frog and toad order. They are carnivorous as adults, but most of the larvae and tadpoles are herbivores. We also see in Anuera the frogs. Frogs are also carnivorous as adults. Their larvae and tadpoles are herbivores, but their tadpoles are so pretty. They have golden spots speckled all over them, and their eggs are globular, so they form clumps of globular eggs that can be fertilized by a male frog. They have smooth, long legs because they like to hop, and they have smooth, slimy skin. They have to stay moist, so they stay near water. They have a more pointed nose and a very slender, athletic looking body. And so you can see some of the differences between the toads and the frogs. Frogs and toads eat bugs, spiders, worms, slugs, larvae, small fish, and even rodents. Honestly, they'll eat anything they can get in their mouth. Frogs and toads help to keep the world's insect population under control, and their tongue whips out and it coils up. And when it flips out, it can dart from their mouth and snap all the way back in within 15/100ths of a second. The next order we'll look at are the salamanders and newts, and these are Urodela. Newts are a subtype of salamander. They can be aquatic or semi-aquatic, and they have webbed feet. They also have a paddle-shaped tail. Those two characteristics are the easiest way to tell newts from salamanders. Salamanders have a more long, slender body like a frog, but they're longer than frogs. And they have a long, slender tail, unlike the newt. And they have toes, and their toes are used for digging, so they're not webbed. And they are predominantly terrestrial, except when they're mating or in their juvenile stages. A few species of salamander have Patiomorphosis, which is these A few species of salamander exhibit patiomorphosis, which is when the adult retains some larval characteristics, like in the axolotl with the gills on the external near the head. This is just an easy depiction of the differences between salamanders and newts, and you can see that axolotl, and the frogs versus the toad. This is an easy way to help you remember the differences in order to prepare for any quizzes or exams. Students should be able to differentiate between types of amphibians. Students should be able to identify the characteristics of the various types of amphibians and amphibians in general.